So thanks very much. That was a very thorough introduction. Thanks, Sandy, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I'll time it so I know that I don't go over time. Good. So like Andy mentioned, I have been working for some time now on a book project which is about relations between two ideas in epistemology that I'm very interested in, but which have developed pretty independently. So one of them is contextualism about knowledge attributions, and I'll explain a little bit just what I mean by that shortly. But another is the idea that knowledge is a fairly fundamental epistemic kind. Knowledge is theoretically important. Knowledge can explain a lot of things. This package of views is sometimes described as the knowledge first program. It's most particularly affiliated with a philosopher called Timothy Williamson. And I have references. So there's a handout that's gone around. Yep, that has gone around. Good. I think there's a lot going for both of these ideas, but I also think, and this is where a lot of, to my mind, the really interesting action is, I also think that these two ideas have something interesting to offer one another. So I've been thinking a lot about connections between the two sorts of projects, and that's the sort of thing I'll be talking about today. I should maybe just say very briefly a little bit about each of these two main ideas. So one of them, contextualism about knowledge attributions, is the thesis that sentences containing the word knows and related sentences like know and knowledge, etc., are context sensitive. That is to say, they express different propositions relative to different conversational contexts. So for example, the word I is context sensitive, so the word I am wearing a hoodie expresses a truth, expresses a fact about me in some contexts, and would express a proposition about somebody else in other contexts, namely contexts where that person is speaking. Contextualists about knowledge attributions think that the word knows works kind of like that. I'll explain in more detail just why one might think that and how that might be as we get into the talk. But that's just having the view on the table. What I'm going to start by talking about is something more in the knowledge first tradition. So you can wrap your head around the knowledge first project by contrasting it with what you might call a traditional sort of knowledge last project. So if you are trying to analyze the concept of knowledge and explain what it is to be knowledge in terms of other states like belief and truth and justification and maybe some other stuff, then you're trying to use these other notions to explicate knowledge. And you think the other stuff is more fundamental and you want to explain what knowledge is in terms of those things. In this very influential book, Knowledge and Its Limits, from 2000, Timothy Williamson suggested that maybe we should work things the other way around. Maybe knowledge is fundamental. We can use knowledge to explain lots of other things. I think that's a very interesting and a very important idea, and I'm pretty much on board with a lot of that project. Today I'll be talking in particular about the application of the Knowledge First program to evidence. So just a brief outline of the talk. Three parts of the talk. I'm going to follow the handout pretty explicitly. You can follow along as I go. You'll notice there are some things that are gray. Those are things that probably I'm going to skip for time. If I find that I'm going faster than I expect to, I might talk about them. If you're able to read text that's written in gray and you have a question about the gray material, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. But probably I'll skip the gray stuff. But otherwise I'll be going straight through in order. You can follow along, see how it's going. First thing that I'll do is I'll talk about Williamson's famous equation of evidence with knowledge, E equals K. And I'll give some motivations for why one might want to understand the notion of evidence in terms of the notion of knowledge. The second thing I'll do in the talk is raise a challenge for that view and give kind of a menu of possible responses to that challenge. I'll pick one of them as the one that I think is best, which is going to be a contextualist response. And then in the third section, I'll develop the kind of contextualism about knowledge that I like in a little bit more detail, and I'll explore a few implications along the way. So that's the project. Here we go. So, Williamson says, and I think there's something right about this, that there's good reason to understand evidence as knowledge. So evidence is a kind of ordinary notion. We have various evidence for various hypotheses. We're interested often in what is the evidence for a particular viewpoint. A good question one might ask is, well, what kind of thing is evidence, and what is it to have evidence? Williamson has answers to each of these questions. I think they're basically right. I should just mention, in this first section, I'm pretty much just going to be presenting Williamson. I don't have a whole lot original to say just yet, but I will pretty soon. But so far, I'm just going to give you the case for E equals K in pretty much Williamson's way. So, first, Williamson suggests the most fundamental notion of evidence ought to be construed as propositional. So this is a view about like the ontology of evidence. What kind of a thing is a bit of evidence? Williamson's answer, it's a proposition. Now, of course, we can talk about evidence in lots of different ways, right? You might think that the police keep evidence in evidence lockers, and maybe you don't think police keep propositions in evidence lockers. That's prima facie some reason to think that maybe objects, not propositions, are evidence. But Williamson suggests the most fundamental roles for the notion of evidence require it to be propositional. So here are three. One, we're often interested in the probability of a particular hypothesis conditional on a bit of evidence. So that is to say, so we're interested, how probable is the proposition that H conditional on the evidence that E? And the standard way to understand this kind of locution is, it's the probability that H is true, conditional on the assumption that E is true. So these have to be the kinds of things that can be true. That is to say, they have to be propositions. That's one motivation for wanting to think of evidence as propositional. Similarly, Williamson suggests, we often seek hypotheses that will best explain our evidence. So if someone is swelling up and turning red, and we wonder why that's so, well, we're looking for an explanation of the fact that he's swelling up and turning red. Maybe it's that he has a peanut allergy. So the relata in this kind of explanation relation are propositions. That's a second reason you might want to think that evidence is propositional. Just one third, we can be concerned with whether a hypothesis is consistent with the evidence or inconsistent with the evidence. But of course, these are notions of propositions. What it is to be consistent is it's possible for them both to be true. So Williamson suggests that I'm going to just go ahead and take on board that this is good reason to think that the fundamental notion of evidence is propositional. The more interesting questions, I think, get into what kind of access do we need to have to a given proposition in order for it to count as evidence. Williamson's answer, of course, is you have to know it. If you know the proposition, then you have that proposition as your evidence. So let's take this one side at a time. First, and this is B on the handout, Williamson suggests that knowledge is necessary for evidence. If you don't know something, then it's not a bit of your evidence. And he considers this to be the best explanation for a particular case that he wants to talk about. I'm going to come back to this case, so I'll go ahead and actually present it. I'll read the case here. So suppose the balls are drawn from a bag with replacement. So you've got a bag, you take a ball, you look at it, and you put it back in. For some suitable number n, the following situation can arise. I've seen draws 1 through n. Each one of those was red. You haven't seen draw n plus 1 yet, but you reason probabilistically and form a justified belief that draw n plus 1 is also red. That is to say, the next ball you haven't seen yet. The belief is in fact true, but you don't know that it was red. You don't know that draw n plus 1 was red. Okay? So you've reasoned, you're saying to yourself, yeah, probably all the balls are red, because I pulled out n of them and they've all been red, so I think they're probably all red. And maybe in fact you're right. But it's not a case of knowledge. You haven't done enough to know that. You just have a justified belief. That's the case Williamson's setting up. Now consider two false hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, H. Draws 1 through n were red, but draw n plus 1 was black. So the first n draws are red, next one's black. H star says the first one was black, and then all the rest of them, up through n plus 1, is red. Williamson writes, it is natural to say that H is consistent with my evidence, and that H star is not. In particular, it's consistent with my evidence that draw n plus 1 was black. It's consistent with my evidence that draw n plus 1 was black. It is not consistent with my evidence that draw 1 was black, because draw 1 you've seen, and you know that it was red. Why not, Williamson says? After all, by hypothesis, you have a justified true belief that that next one was red. The obvious answer is that you don't know that it was red, and so the unsatisfied necessary condition for evidence is knowledge. Now, there are various ways one might resist this argument. But I actually think the more interesting action, at least for my purposes, is on the other side. That is to say, the sufficiency of knowledge for evidence. So Williamson also goes on to argue that knowing that P is sufficient for having P as evidence, or that is to say, I say he argues it, he claims it. There's actually, if you look at the text, not a lot of argument for that claim. What he does in that section of his book is he responds to particular reasons you might want to deny that. But there's not really a positive argument for the claim. And in my view, this is where a lot of the most interesting action is. So this is where I want to focus for the challenge to E equals K that I'm going to go on to consider pretty much now. So just to explain my attitude so far, obviously there are lots of ways to resist E equals K. I don't pretend to have proven that it's true or anything. I hope I've given some motivation, given you the flavor of what's in Williamson, why someone might want to have this kind of view. And I'm now going to proceed on the assumption that it's a view that has some kind of plausibility to it. It's a nice theoretical framework. Now I'll look at a challenge to the view and consider some ways that one might respond to it. So this challenge comes from an unpublished paper manuscript by Brian Weatherson. It works like this. So take a case of inductive knowledge. That is to say, suppose that S knows that H, but knows that H on the basis of some E, some evidence E, which does not entail H. So, for example, maybe you've observed a whole bunch of emeralds and they've all been green. So now you have as evidence that all those emeralds were green. And you know on that basis, you do some induction, you come to know that all emeralds are green. That might be a case like this. Interestingly, you can even have a version of Williamson's own case that works just like this, on the assumption that if you draw enough balls, eventually you'll come to know that they're all red. If you think that, then consider a big enough number so that you know inductively that all the balls are red, and then Williamson's own case is going to look just like the sort of case that we want here. So we're stipulating inductive knowledge, that is to say, knowledge on the basis of non-entailing evidence. Now consider these two false hypotheses. And you'll see we're structuring this just like Williamson's own argument in favor of the necessity of knowledge for evidence. Consider these two false hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, E, but not H. That is to say, those N emeralds that I looked at were green, but not all emeralds are green. Or those N balls that I examined were red, but the next ball won't be red. That's an example of false hypothesis 1. False hypothesis 2, H but not E. So all the remaining emeralds are green, but it's not the case that all the ones that I looked at are green. Well, here, Weatherson says, and I think he's right as far as this goes, are some intuitive data. 1. Claim number 1 there, E but not H, the observed emeralds are green, but not all emeralds are green, is consistent with S's evidence, with the subduced evidence. But hypothesis 2 is not consistent with that evidence. Has just the same structure as Williamson's own argument here. But this is going to be a problem for E equals K. Remember, by hypothesis, H is known. H is a bit of inductive knowledge. So H is the proposition that all emeralds are green. We've stipulated that the subject knows that all emeralds are green. So 1 that says E but not H, the observed emeralds are green but not all of them, is inconsistent with what is known. That's just straightforwardly true. You know that it's green, so it's inconsistent with, you know that all emeralds are green, so it's inconsistent with everything you know that not all emeralds are green. So by E equals K, false hypothesis 1 there is inconsistent with S's evidence. But the intuitive data was that false hypothesis 1 is consistent with S's evidence. So this argument goes, E equals K is false. So that's Brian Weatherson's argument against E equals K. And as I sort of highlighted along the way, there's a very strong parallel between this argument and Williamson's own argument for the necessity of knowledge. So why might you think these come apart? Or how could you resist this kind of an argument? How can we motivate requiring as much as knowledge, but not requiring more, the way that the Weatherson argument seems to suggest you might need to? Well, I think it's interesting to look at a parallel between this argument from Weatherson against E equals K and a more familiar sort of epistemological argument, roughly having to do with the skeptical paradox, or kind of closure challenges, arguments from ignorance. There are a cluster of views around here. I'm going to formulate an argument against epistemic closure that has just this shape, because that's going to be the most parallel for some of the purposes that I want to draw out. So what's epistemic closure? Epistemic closure is roughly the idea that if you know that P, and if you competently deduce the Q from P, and you still know that P, then you can come to know that Q. There are some debates about just how to formulate that, but the intuitive idea is enough for what I'm after right now. the closure is supposed to be theoretically appealing. It's an attractive view. If you know something and you deduce something else from it, then you can know that new thing as well. That's the idea behind closure. But look, here's a challenge to closure. Here's an argument against closure. Take some ordinary fact that we would ordinarily be inclined to say that I know. And take some skeptical scenario that is obviously inconsistent with it. So for example, for some ordinary fact, call it O, we might consider O to be the proposition that I have hands, to take a famous example, and consider S to be the skeptical scenario that I'm a brain in a vat who has no hands. Intuitively, it seems like I know that O. Intuitively, it seems I don't know that S. How could I know that I don't? How could I know that I'm not a brain in a vat? But obviously, there's an inconsistency between those two contents. Or you can take a different kind of case. You can let O be the proposition that I won't be a millionaire next week, and S be the proposition that my lottery ticket will win. This is another sort of case where it seems like I know the ordinary thing, but it seems like I don't know the skeptical thing's not true. And here's how the argument goes. In each of these cases, O obviously entails the negation of H. The negation of S. So that I won't be a millionaire next week entails, relative to some background assumptions, that my lottery ticket won't win. Or that I have hands entails that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. So here's an argument. Since O obviously entails not S, and since intuitively I know that O, by closure, I must know, or at least I could easily come to know, the negation of S. But that's counterintuitive. S is the sort of thing where it looks like you can't know that it doesn't obtain, according to certain skeptical intuitions, so closure is false. Right? There's an argument against closure. So not a lot of epistemologists accept this argument. There are a couple. Dretsky and Nozick seem to have accepted something pretty much like this argument. But for the most part, epistemologists tend, even in the face of a kind of skeptical pressure sort of argument from ignorance against closure, tend to reject something else other than closure. So what I would like to do is lay out a kind of space of options, lay out the kinds of responses to this sort of puzzle that are in the literature. And what I'll do in the next section is suggest that these have interesting parallels in the case of the argument against E equals K from Brian Weatherston. So here are 4 ways to resist the closure argument. And these, again, I'm not doing much original right now. This is just a summary of what's going on in the epistemological literature. But what I'll do once they're out on the table is compare them to the case of E equals K and try to get somewhere interesting out of that connection. So, how might you resist the argument against closure? Closure is a very appealing theoretical principle, but we have an argument against it. How can you resist the argument? Well, here's one way. You can be a skeptic. So you can say, in any of these cases, I know we started with the intuition that I know that I have hands, or that I know I won't be a millionaire next week, but maybe we should just deny those intuitions. Maybe we're a little bit too liberal in our sort of casual assessment of knowledge, and really we don't know this stuff. We just know, maybe that it's kind of likely, or maybe that the evidence suggests that or something, but we don't really have knowledge here. That's an option. It's not maybe a great option. Some people like it. I'm including it for space here, but let me press on. We'll lay them all out. So skepticism is one option. Here's another option. You can take a kind of Morean stance. So you do the modus tollens to the skeptic's modus ponens. You say, well, look, I know I have hands. Who could possibly doubt that? And of course, anyone with hands is not a handless brain in a vat. So yeah, I know I'm not a handless brain in a vat. I know we have the skeptical intuition that says I don't know that, but that skeptical intuition is just wrong. I really do know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. That's an option. That's a pretty popular option, really. Lots of people go that way. You can go that way, or you can do the same thing with the sort of lottery-style case. Yeah, I'm not gonna be a millionaire next week. Obviously, I know that. And so, of course, that means, since if I win the lottery, I will be a millionaire next week, I guess that means I won't win the lottery. That one actually sounds a little less intuitive, doesn't it? But it's a structural parallel. And there's no reason you have to give the same answer in each of these cases. But that's a second option, a second way to resist the closure argument. And again, in a minute, I'm going to come back and apply all these to the case of evidence. Here's a third option. You can be a kind of shifty invariantist, in a way I'll describe in a second. So you can say that whether you know the ordinary proposition, so sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. And it depends not just on traditional epistemic factors, but it depends on some kind of surprising things, like which possibilities you're thinking about. So the idea here, people sometimes call this view subject-sensitive invariantism. It's actually not a good name for this view, but it's the name that's out there. So a subject-sensitive invariantist will say, yeah, whether you know you have hands depends on whether you're thinking about brains and bats. When you're ignoring the possibility of a brain and a bat, then you do know that you have hands. But when you're thinking about that possibility, then you don't. Now this is another way to defend closure, although it's a little bit less obvious just how this is. And it depends in some cases on just the proper formulation of the closure principle. But the idea is, anytime you start talking about brains and bats, you move into a situation where you no longer have that knowledge you started with. So you don't have to be a skeptic. You don't have to say, nobody ever knows they have hands. You just have to say, nobody knows they have hands while they're thinking about being brains and bats. But since most people don't think about brains and bats most of the time, most people do know they have hands most of the time. That's another view. That's a kind of weird view. People think it's strange that knowledge will depend on attention facts like this, but it's a possible view that one might have. And finally, as is traditional, I'll finish my list of options with the view that I like. You can be a contextualist. So I mentioned contextualism at the beginning of the talk, right? Contextualism is the thesis that the language around here is context sensitive. So a sentence like, Jonathan knows he has hands, or Jonathan knows he's not a handless brain in a vat. These are context sensitive sentences, a little bit like sentences that contain indexicals. They express different propositions. In some sense, they mean different things in different conversational contexts. So the idea here is there are more skeptical and less skeptical contexts. In a more skeptical context, the word knows expresses a very strong epistemic relation. So if we're in a skeptical context, like we're talking about brains and bats and everything, then if I start saying things like, Jonathan knows he has hands, if I use that sentence, I say that Jonathan stands in this very strong epistemic relation to the proposition that he has hands. Where in a less skeptical context, I might use the very same words to express a much weaker idea. That he's, in some lesser epistemic position toward that proposition. You can retain closure this way as well, because within each context, you have the knowledge of the ordinary proposition and the negation of the skeptical hypothesis holding together. So in the skeptical context, it's false, the sentence, Jonathan knows he has hands. And the sentence, Jonathan knows he's not a brain in a vat, is also false. In the non-skeptical context, both those sentences are actually true. It's kind of weird to say that it's true in the non-skeptical context to say, Jonathan knows he's not a brain in a vat. But the contextualist trick here is to say, that's because anytime you actually said that sentence, you'd probably shift to a more skeptical context. So you can't really say that relative to the non-skeptical context. It's kind of clever. I like this sort of view. I'll talk in the next section in a little more detail about just how I prefer to implement a view like this. I'll just mention for now that my own view is that the contextualist resolution of this puzzle for closure is the correct one. Although, obviously, all I've done is lay out a bunch of options. I haven't given you an argument that contextualism is the best answer. I'm just telling you I think it is. So the argument against closure on the contextualist view, the argument that says, look, H is known, O is known, O obviously entails not S, but not S is not known, therefore closure is false. That argument equivocates. Because when I said O is known, the ordinary proposition is known, I was using the word knows to express the weaker relation. But once I'm talking about not S, once I'm talking about the skeptical scenarios, my word knows expresses a stronger relation. It's the same word, but it equivocates. It's like if I said, that's a water bottle, therefore that's a water bottle, right? Invalid argument, even though it's of the form, in some sense, of the form like S, therefore S. But I'm referring to different things, the argument equivocates. That's what the contextualist thinks about the skeptical argument here. All right. Now, an interesting fact, I think, is that the mistake on the handout, I mentioned these 5 options, but I've cut it down to 4 for time. The 4 options I've just mentioned, at the bottom of page 2 here, the 4 options for holding on to closure correspond to 4 ways one might try to defend E equals K from the Weatherson argument. So just like I've shown you 4 possible strategies for holding on to the theoretically appealing principle of closure, so too are there 4 reasonably closely corresponding possibilities for holding on to the reasonably plausible theoretical principle that E equals K. So let's go through them. 1, you can be a skeptic. In fact, you need to do just exactly the same thing you did before. If you think there's not possible knowledge on the basis of non-entailing evidence, so you're a skeptic about induction of a certain sort, then you don't think that the arguments that we presented against E equals K can ever get off the table. So that one's easy. You can also do a kind of Moorian thing. So you can say, look, I have a bit of knowledge here. It's inductive knowledge. I know by induction that all emeralds are green, and E equals K. Therefore, I have as evidence that all emeralds are green. You can just kind of flat out say that. I know there's an intuition to the contrary, but yeah, skeptical intuitions are just wrong sometimes. And this is one of those instances. That's a possible response too. It seems fine. You can do the shifty thing. You can be a subject-sensitive invariantist kind of person. That is to say, when you're thinking about the gap between the evidence and the hypothesis, when you're thinking about the fact that it's merely an inductive connection, when that happens, it's not knowledge, just like we said before, but it's also, when that happens, not evidence in these cases. And of course that's just what's going on during the time that Weatherson invites us to consider the case. So in support of something like this kind of shiftiness, notice that the intuition that inductively supported hypotheses cannot be evidence is not entirely stable. There are certain contexts where we can think that actually we do want to describe them as a bit of knowledge. So here's a case. I mean the trick is, have the inductively supported hypothesis be evidence for something unrelated, for something else, that's not reminding you of the merely inductive connection between the evidential base and that hypothesis itself. So maybe I know by induction that all emeralds are green, and I also know somehow or other that Ji Chang hates green things. That's a fact about Ji Chang that I know. And I learned that you just gave her an emerald. Well, now I think it's likely that Ji Chang is displeased. Why is that? Well, maybe I say to myself, what's my evidence that Ji Chang is displeased? Well, she just got something green. I know that you gave her an emerald, and emeralds are green, all emeralds are green, so so she has something green now, so she's probably displeased. That's probable conditional on my evidence. And maybe, it's intuitive to say, among that evidence is that she got something green. But that's something that's only inductively supported by hypothesis. So whether we think of it as inductive or not might make a difference for whether it is evidence. And again, you can model another version of a similar sort of shiftiness in a contextualist framework. And again, this is going to be my own preferred view. You can say that the word evidence, like the word knows, is context sensitive. And the version of this view that I like is the following. In any given context, these two sentences, sentence 1, S knows that P, and sentence 2, S's evidence includes the proposition that P, have the same truth value relative to any given context. In a context, if one of them is true, then the other is true, and indeed vice versa. So once again, we can say that the Weatherson argument equivocates. When we start by saying, this is obviously a bit of inductive knowledge, there we're in a less skeptical context. That's why we're inclined to grant it the status knowledge. But later on, when we say, it's consistent with the evidence that the next emerald is going to be blue, now we're in a more skeptical context, because we're pointing out the respect in which the evidence falls short of certainty. So we can think that this, again, represents a kind of equivocation. We started in a non-skeptical context, but we moved to a skeptical one. And any argument that says knowledge and evidence can't be the same trades on a shift in context partway through. That's the suggestion. Okay. So what I would like to do with the rest of the talk is spell out in a little bit more detail the particular approach to contextualism that I like. Because it turns out that the combination of these two views, the contextualism about evidence and E equals K, along with my form of contextualism about knowledge, point to some interesting areas of further research. So that's what I'm going to do in the last 10 minutes here. So let me start by presenting a particular form of contextualism, and it's the form that David Lewis, in his famous paper, Elusive Knowledge, suggested. Lewis described his view like this. It's on the handout here. S knows proposition P if and only if P holds in every possibility left unilluminated by S's evidence. So we need to make several notes here. Note number one. Lewis is using the word evidence in a very specific way. He stipulates that evidence corresponds to just the facts about S's subjective experience. So this is a very different kind of usage than the Williamsonian use of evidence that I like. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Second thing to make clear, the word every here. P holds in every possibility left unilluminated by the evidence. That every is a context-sensitive word. So every in general is a context-sensitive word, right? If I say everybody's sitting down while looking at you right now, what I mean is, all the people who are listening to me talking in the audience are sitting down. I wasn't talking about me. I wasn't talking about various people outside. I wasn't talking about my colleagues in Vancouver. I wasn't saying they're sitting down. I was just saying that y'all were sitting down. So the word every is a context-sensitive word. And Lewis is going to rely on that fact to characterize these context-sensitive truth conditions for knowledge attributions. The idea is, which possibilities count for a given knowledge attribution depends on context. If you want to satisfy knows in a context, then your evidence has to eliminate all the not P possibilities relevant in that context. Context determines, or partly determines, which possibilities are relevant. And we intend this statement to hold true in every context, right? Similar to the way that I'm holding E equals K true in every context. So S knows P is true in a given context if and only if S's evidence eliminates all not P possibilities is true in that very same context, with the all understood in the particular Lewisian way. It's not too hard to demonstrate that this kind of approach can do the contextualist thing to the closure puzzle. Maybe in the interest of time, I won't step through it right now, although I'm happy to if someone wants to ask about it in the Q&A. But this is just it's a fairly straightforward version of contextualism that, like many versions of contextualism, has it that the argument against closure that I mentioned a little while ago will be equivocal. What I would like to emphasize, or what I would like to introduce, is a modification of Lewis that I've argued in some previous work is necessary for various reasons. Because it's this modification that's going to have interesting combinations once we plug in E equals K and all the views that I've put on the table so far. So my modification of Lewis, which I also have on the handout, introduces a belief requirement and a basing requirement. It says this: S knows P, just in case, for some evidence E, two things hold. Number one, S believes that P on the basis of E. And number two, E eliminates all the not P cases, where that all is Lewis's context-sensitive restricted quantifier. So like Lewis, my view is context-sensitive, but I've added sort of an extra role for the evidence to play. It needs to play this kind of basing role, all right? Now, in my paper where I introduced this before, I expressed neutrality about how to understand evidence in those terms. I pointed to various ways one might understand it. But now I'd like to get a little bit more specific. In particular, I'd like to invoke what it seems to me is the best view about evidence, namely E equals K. So I'm going to stick to my previous statement of the truth condition for knowledge attributions, but I'm going to clarify that when I say evidence, I think that evidence is knowledge, E equals K. Now you might think, hang on, Jonathan, this is blatantly circular. We're giving an account of knowledge in terms of evidence, but you're explaining evidence in terms of knowledge. In response, I want to say two things. First, let me just clarify and remind you, I'm not interested in the project of providing a reductive analysis of knowledge. This is a project that I think the sort of knowledge first program is right to give up on. So I'm not interested in analyzing, so I don't need non-circularity in that sense. There's also no straightforward sense in which we get triviality, given the basing requirement that I've indicated. If we had Lewis's own view, I'll write it down. If we had Lewis's own view, it said S knows that P just in case S's evidence eliminates all the not P cases. So if you had that view along with E equals K, then you'd say that you know that P just in case your knowledge eliminates the not P cases, which is all but trivial. But my view has more than that. It has this basing thing. For you to know that P, you have to believe that P on the basis of some knowledge that eliminates all the not P cases, some sufficient knowledge, all right? So that's not trivial. There's a basing requirement. A really obvious, plausible development here then considers the notion of basic knowledge. Under what circumstances do you need some separate knowledge on which to base your belief? Or are there some things that you can know on the basis of itself? Can there be basic knowledge in that sense? The framework really invites that there could be. What should you think that it is? Well, maybe the most sort of obvious choice you might consider is, this super-internalist stuff. If you do that, then you'll have a view much like Lewis's. So maybe facts about what kinds of experiences I'm having, facts about my own sensory states, constitute basic knowledge. That's a possible view. So if you have that view, then if you're in a context where brain and vat worlds are relevant, then the sentence, Jonathan knows he has hands, will be false because my evidence, namely the facts about my, namely the things that I know relative to that context, that is to say, the facts about my sensory experiences don't rule out some of the no-hand possibilities, namely the brain and vat ones. But Jonathan knows that he has hand-like appearances can still be true relative to that context, because it can be held on the basis of itself. It can be known on the basis of the fact that Jonathan has hand-like appearances, which is a bit of basic knowledge. That's a possible view. It's not the only possible view that you can have. And there's some reasons that I'm now coming to suspect that might not be the best version of the view. So let me just outline another version of the view. I'm really not sure just what the right way to do this is, but I think this is an option that's been underexplored. You can do a more Morean thing within this Lewisian contextualist framework. You can allow for some perceptual knowledge of the external world to be basic in the sense we've been talking about. Maybe when I see that I have hands, the fact that I have hands can be a bit of basic knowledge for me. It can be something that I know just on the basis of the fact itself. If that's true, then even in contexts where brain and vat worlds are relevant, you might have Jonathan knows he has hands expressing a truth. Because although brain and vat worlds are relevant, my evidence eliminates those worlds. My evidence includes the proposition that I have a hand, a bit of basic knowledge. This is a view that's very foreign to a lot of the motivation of Lewis's project in elusive knowledge. He's really interested in the radical skeptical intuitions. But as a number of contemporary epistemologists have suggested, that's not the only reason you might want to be a contextualist. There's other kinds of shiftiness in more mundane ways as well. You can still get, say, lottery shiftiness, or if you're familiar with bank cases or things like that, then you can have contextual shiftiness about those sorts of things too. So one can have a more moderate, a less skeptic-friendly, more Morean form of Lewisian contextualism. This is an interesting option that I think has really been underexplored in the literature. Okay, let me just say one more thing. I have 2 minutes, so I will use them. So my view is E equals K holds in every context. S knows P is true in a context if and only if S's evidence includes P is true in that very same context. But here's an objection. Don't the Weatherson cases provide exactly intuitive counterexamples to this view? Aren't these contexts where the evidence description is intuitively false, but the knowledge description is intuitively true? Well, my answer is not necessarily. And the reason that's not necessarily so is because which words we use, which things we say, has an effect on the conversational context. It works kind of in both directions. And it might be, and I sort of think this is kind of plausible, it might be that talk of evidence tends to put us in more skeptical contexts. Certainly challenging for evidence. If I ask you, what is your evidence for P? I'm engaging in a skeptical activity. I'm sort of raising the epistemic standards. And maybe this is a little bit less obvious, but I think this might be right. even talking about evidence constitutes a kind of, at least in many cases, a kind of shift toward a more skeptical attitude. If you compare just the flat-out assertion that P to my describing of the evidence for P, the assertion seems to be taking it for granted. The evidence seems to be putting us in a more skeptical kind of context. If that's right, then we don't have to think there are any particular contexts where E equals K fails. Okay, I know I've said quite a lot and I went pretty fast. I want to leave lots of time for discussion, so I will stop now. Thanks very much.